Hmm. Uh, huh?
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, featuring your hosts, Taylor Field and Ruben Olson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're going to be getting a little bit more into UFOs, but we're going to kind of tailor it, no pun intended, to presidents and the relations between these two things. So before we get into that, we're going to just do a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can also find us on our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Additionally, you can also find us on our Patreon, where you can get ad-free, exclusive early episodes available there. And if you want to say hi or have any questions, just want to shout out, you can reach us at cryptidclues@gmail.com. Without further ado, let's get into this. So I thought let's start off with a rather famous presidential UFO occurrence here. It's such an event that ironically took place before Jimmy Carter became the 39th president of the United States of America. And again, he served a term from 1977 to 1981. So back in 1969, roughly 2 years prior to becoming the governor of Georgia, Carter was prepping for a speech at a Lions Club meeting, and everything was the norm until roughly 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time. One of the attendees called out a strange object that appeared visible about 30 degrees above the horizon to the west of where Carter himself was standing. Now, Carter saw it and described this object as such: a bright white, about as bright as the moon. It closed in to where he was standing, but still retained its distance beyond the pine trees. The object then began to change color, first to blue, then red, and finally back to white before receding into the distance and vanishing. Now, Carter also felt as though the object was self-illuminated and not solid in nature. So the report filed also indicated that it was witnessed by about 10 to 12 people and was in view for about 11 minutes before it vanished. Now, the exact date of this sighting occurring has not been properly disclosed. However, one report that Carter had supposedly filed with the International UFO Bureau 4 years later shows that the sighting happened in October. However, investigators that took it upon themselves had found that the Lions Club records showed that it occurred 9 months before that. Investigations took place in 1976, and while Jimmy Carter was running for his presidency, he made a point of stating in his campaign that, should he be elected, he would institute a policy of openness on the UFO topic. And now, from what I have found, ever since President Franklin Roosevelt, this information has been kept top secret. But that hasn't stopped each president since from wanting to come forward and disclose information about it. And if you do or don't want to hear it, former President Trump played a hand in this as well. When Trump signed that $2 trillion COVID-19 relief and government funding bill into law, a 180-day countdown initialized for the U.S. intelligence agencies to reveal to Congress what they knew about UFOs, or UAPs as well as the term these days. Such information has flooded online, some videos and lots of documented reports of sightings from across not only the country but the world. I've read many of these sightings myself, and it's fascinating. I definitely recommend go on Google and just start reading them. But at its core, each president seems to share a common fascination with UFOs, but also don't really seem to know what they are. This is either based on a lie or genuinely being kept in the dark, like Independence Day's president was on Area 51, for example. So in relation to this, let's look at former President Obama, and I quote, "What is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory. They did not have an easily explainable pattern. And so, I think that people still take seriously trying to investigate and figure out what that is." End quote. So we have these statements coming from former presidents and presidents all in regards to this. And we've seen with interviews with President Joe Biden, he very easily enjoys dismissing the UFO narrative, which is to no surprise, but the sudden shift of UFO interest just sort of going poof, this seems out of place to me. Now, of course, we have much bigger fish to fry on our little blue space ball of a world, like COVID and war that is ongoing right now. These things can't be dismissed, and of course, something like aliens and UFOs would easily take a back seat to such things. But it's worth noting, in my opinion, such horrible human events in the past haven't necessarily derailed previous presidents from expressing and maintaining interest in UFOs. So let's go back here a little bit and talk about the 34th president of the United States. Specifically, before he became president, Dwight Eisenhower. When he was serving in Europe, he actually issued a press release that acknowledged unidentified objects were interacting with Allied planes, to which they called Foo Fighters. So the term Foo Fighter, again, is given to strange balls of light seen by pilots during World War II. If you really hone in on some of these Foo Fighter reports, the mention of physical crafts and structures becomes pretty apparent in these reports, actually. So these occurrences were witnessed by both US and UK pilots. Now, again, this is something that they attributed to maybe a new Nazi super weapon or something along those lines. And I believe this was actually an article published in the New York Times. And that is just, I read an article speaking to about that article. Now, finding that actual article, that is the tricky part. This is something where I think Google likes to play a hand in with its search engine, because it makes finding proper information on a concrete ground very difficult. So take that with a grain of salt. But the term Foo Fighters, look into that, because that one I definitely hold very, very high regard. You have war just covering Europe, and you have these lights and these structures that are flying around showing interest in this. And you're dealing with pilots, again, who are getting very alarmed because they're not able to keep up. I mean, you look at some World War II planes, and while they were definitely an impressive level of ingenuity on man's part for what they could do, they in no way could compare to the maneuverability or the capabilities of these Foo Fighters that were being witnessed. So again, of course, pilots and soldiers are going to be terrified in the front lines of war. And that's when the whole narrative comes out, thinking, oh my goodness, is this something to do with Hitler or the Nazi weaponry or something like that? And it's no secret that there was indeed some like saucer kind of thing that Hitler and his scientists were working on. That's a whole other topic though. But yet another huge and easily forgotten moment in history happens to be under President Roosevelt's term. This is throughout February 24th to 25th of 1942. Months after Pearl Harbor, it became a degree of paranoia that the West Coast was exposed to a Japanese attack once America had retaliated and entered the war. Rumors kept growing of Japanese submarines and aircraft carriers looming in closer to the West Coast, and this resulted in anti-aircraft guns and soldiers being set up in key points on American soil. And then comes February 24th, 1942. The Office of Naval Intelligence issued a warning that California could expect an attack within the next 10 hours. And sure enough, that evening, flares and lights were reported in the sky, and the alert was called at 7:18 p.m. and was not halted until 10:23 p.m. Air raid sirens sounded, and during this total blackout that was ordered, thousands of air raid wardens rushed to their posts, and we see the artillery brigades beginning to fire up 50 caliber machine guns and 12-pound anti-aircraft shells all into the air at this reported craft. There was over 1,400 shells that were fired. Pilots were ordered to stay grounded and not get into their planes and take off and engage. Several buildings were damaged along with some vehicles from the shell fragments, and 5 civilians actually died as well. Within hours of the raid, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, actually held a press conference stating it was a false alarm, and then the military reiterated this the next day in their statement. Now, the important thing here is, after the war ended, the Japanese government declared it had flown no airplanes or craft over LA during the war. And in 1983, it was concluded to be a meteorological balloon that was the cause of the alarm. Now, yes, you are in war and you don't take chances and things can happen. I've never been in war. I mean, I can't imagine the level of paranoia and caution you have to exercise, especially when you have rumors that up in Alaska there are Japanese aircraft carriers looming in and submarines that could be firing off. You just don't know. So when something like this happens, you rush to deal with it. But I think that the thing that to me seems out of place is the pilots were ordered to stay grounded. They relied just on their ground fire to deal with such a thing, and they dismissed it right away. I feel like when you have the results of civilians dying in such an occurrence, that it needs to be more addressed. And something like this is, from most people I speak to, left in the dark. People are very unaware that this happened, the Battle of Los Angeles. And this is such a thing that they even did a movie about it, Battle LA, which is actually a really, really good movie with Aaron Eckhart. But that being said, I think that there is something a little bit more deeper attached to this. Now, the main thing to note as well here is that after this supposed Battle of LA, Roosevelt started to become attributed to documents mentioning specific, and I quote, not of this world technology. And this is all stemming from keywords that were starting to appear in these memos that people were finding, and such keywords could be attributed to celestial and super weapons. So these are things that become relatable to UFOs and UFO researchers. And it's important to know that once that atomic bomb dropped, it's like turning on the lamp in a dark forest. A fair share of things out there in those woods will see you with that light, so you can bet that it caught the attention of a lot of UFOs, which leads to UFOs becoming even more prominent moving forward. And with that, I'm just going to jump to a quick ad break, and we'll be right back. And we're back. So, in 1952, Washington, D.C. was actually subject to a series of UFO sightings, and this has been known as the invasion of Washington. This took place over the course of consecutive weekends, July 19th to 20th and July 26th to 27th. Newspapers actually described this event as saucers swarming over Capitol. And this actually caught President Truman's attention as well, as there was a massive buildup of sightings over the United States in 1952, especially in July. Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base kept tracking tons of mysterious blips all over their radar. But that's not a first occurrence for seeing UFOs attributed or associated with Air Force bases. That seems to be the general norm. So when you're looking at bases that work with missiles, ballistics, and very dangerous weapons of war, there are reports that come out of these places from workers and personnel that describe unidentified ships and crafts expressing extreme interest. Sometimes, when I say interaction, I would refer to it more as light than an actual being or an arm coming out of a ship or something like that. But an element of interaction to a very small degree that inhibits these dangerous weapons as being inactive, being irrelevant, I guess you could say, not capable of firing. This is something that I keep seeing prominent among different bases, different people reporting it. These things, to me, appear to be concerned. Now we have, again, this dynamic where presidents are expressing interest and presidents want to talk about it and they use it as campaign fuel, and once that comes into play, they don't necessarily do anything about it. There's so many presidents that are trying to keep this under wraps, like Roosevelt. This is a president that's highly attributed to being someone who knew a lot about UFOs and aliens, and there's a prominent amount of books out that kind of go FDR to Obama and everything in between about UFOs. So when you look at some presidents that were trying to keep it under wraps, I believe Ronald Reagan was another one that actually wanted to keep it close to the chest and didn't want to get into it. So it's just interesting how now we have a president like Trump that just dished out by law these documents, and now we have everything being there for the taking to read, and it's just being kind of left on the doorstep because not everyone is really taking note or being aware of it. There are people, I'm assuming like yourselves, if you're just joining it for the first time, you're curious, or you're a prominent listener who returns every week, you look into these things actively, and that's fantastic. But there's still so many people that dismiss it. They see it pop up on the news every once in a while, but then those are the mediums that it's almost like the narrative wants us to embrace. they don't really want you to go onto Google and look at it for yourself, but on your Saturday Night Lives or your news, and I've mentioned this before, the news anchor will kind of smile and be like, well, how about this? We might have our own UFO sighting in our own backyard. And it's like, oh, it just kind of puts that stigma out there. And you don't want this to be attributed to the stereotype of a person in a rundown vehicle out in like the back country. I mean, I just think that's so wrong. Everyone on this earth is subject to possibly seeing these things, and we're all human beings. And to spin that kind of stigma onto flying saucers or ships, I think that's wrong. So the last thing to note here, though, before we close out, is former President Bill Clinton. He had an interview in 2014 with Jimmy Kimmel. And again, this is kind of where I attribute it again to that kind of medium narrative that they just want people to kind of laugh and chuckle and make it a lighthearted kind of gag. So he was talking about the Roswell incident, and he was asked, and I quote, "If you saw that there were aliens there, would you tell us?" To which Clinton responded, "Yeah, if we were visited someday, I wouldn't be surprised. I just hope it's not like Independence Day." He then went on to discuss the positives of an alien invasion, like how it could unify the human race under one banner, so to speak. Oddly enough, this is a reiteration from another former president, Ronald Reagan, who said, and I quote, "Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world." End quote. This statement was spoken before the United Nations in 1987. Now, it's very odd to push a war of any kind, especially an intergalactic one. That would be very, very scary. But I get the odd poetic positivity that is just sort of outcoming from this, I guess, the form that they're looking at. Now, human unity could make us the ultimate force in not only our solar system, but our galaxy, and the level of ingenuity we could conjure and control in a society that brought everyone forward together and left no one behind. That is a powerful statement and sentiment. And as long as it's for the right reasons, I would be behind that, and not based on a lie. I only mention the lie because what if presidents are indeed lying about these things? I hope, in my personal opinion, that maybe they are indeed oblivious and kept in the dark. And this is something that may or may not be eventually answered when UFOs finally decide to land on our doorstep and help shed light on the situation. But I've been exploring a lot of documentaries and just kind of gather in a little bit of archive of insight on this kind of thing. And there seems to be a lot of similarities between presidents on this, and a fascination. And it's not the first time, though, that I keep stumbling upon presidents possibly not knowing this information. They want to disclose it, but when it comes to the point that they want to talk about it, they are put into a corner where they're not allowed to. And this is something that maybe I like to see it as governments are not directly responsible for going in and dealing with Bigfoot or Dogman or other cryptids, but you're dealing with independent agencies that are shadows. You never ever have the ability to know who or what is operating with these organizations, not even the presidents of the governments. They might be aware that there are certain things that exist, and there are as well certain things to deal with these problems. And I think that's probably a result of these shadow organizations. There are several videos of UFOs out there, and several attributed to, the American government, governments of the world, presidents, prime ministers. And some of them show these craft coming into low Earth orbit, dodging away and dealing with what almost looks like beams of light shooting from the Earth. And that, again, in itself is very questionable. So do the presidents know? Are they oblivious? Or is this indeed just some larger plan at work that's keeping us in the dark? It's something that I'm going to have to keep researching and figuring out. I know there are the different degrees of encounters. Encounters of the first, second, third, and fourth kind. And this is something I want to get into with Ruben. It's a very fascinating topic. And if you haven't heard of such a thing yet, I definitely advise you to go Google it and look into it. Some of it can get a little bit spooky, but it's just a way of explaining and adding a title to the different forms of interaction with UFOs. And so the main things, again, I was talking about here was just the sightings and the association with the government and the president. There's such a massive archive, though, of information that you can explore that talks about governments and UFOs. This is just barely the cusp on it. But I just wanted to put this out there as a stepping stone into a larger world that shows what presidents were talking about in relation to UFOs, and just that it's a reoccurring thing among the American government. And I personally can't wait to keep exploring this and getting more into it. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction. Again, these occurrences I've been wanting to talk about because I was exploring these documentaries focused on the UFO phenomena, and I highly recommend that you explore it too, because it's a journey. But without further ado, that's all I got for today. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction, and we'll definitely be back diving way more into this, because the amount of information I was pulling was flabbergasting. So you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can also find us with our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And if you want, you can send us an email, CryptidClues@gmail.com, or you can join us on Patreon, get ad-free early episodes available there. So I hope you enjoyed this Friday episode, and I look forward to being back with you guys next week. So stay safe and take care.